book of Judges, chapter number 11, and also find the book of Hebrews, chapter number 11. Hebrews 11, Judges 11, we'll spend time in both those places this morning. We have come to a point in America where it seemed like the majority, and Brother Donnie mentioned it when we were praying today, the majority of Christians don't stand up for what is right, what we should stand up for. And we get into the book of Judges and really see over and over and over again through the book of Judges that is exactly what was taking place in that period of time. In fact, the book of Judges, over and over and over again, you'll see the phrase, "And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord." It happens over and over. Judges is home to some of the more famous stories in our Old Testament. And if you have the book of Judges, it's got the story of Samson. We all know the story of Samson. We know the story of Gideon. That's in the book of Judges. There is the story of Deborah and Barak in the book of Judges. You have the story of Jephthah, which we'll talk about this morning. But every time that God would do something miraculous for the children of Israel, bring them back into a place of blessing, it wouldn't be very long until they started to backslide again. And it is unfortunately repeated over and over. It's a cycle that you see, a spiritual cycle that is blessings come, and then apostasy takes place in the heart of man, and then judgment becomes because of that. And as a result of judgment that comes and oppression, there's repentance, and once repentance comes, there's forgiveness, and then we're back to the top again, and it's just over and over and over. It's a cycle. And the truth be told, if we were honest with each other and with ourselves, that is a cycle that's played out in our own personal lives more than we would like to admit. And that is, we get where we need to be, or we're working our relationship towards God, and we're getting where we ought to be, and we're walking close with Him, and we're in fellowship with Him. God pours out blessings, and in the middle of the blessing, somehow we end up getting back in sin. He sends some judgment, or at least some divine discipline. We repent, He forgives, and it starts all over again. And the same thing is taking place in Judges. Now we're into chapter 11 this morning, where we talk about Jephthah, and God has already sent a deliverer. The children of Israel have gotten right, and yet when you get into chapter 10, you find that they've backslidden again, and they don't know what they're going to do. In Judges chapter 11 and verse number 1, it says this: "Now Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty man of valor, and he was the son of an harlot, and Gideon begat Jephthah. And Gilead's wife bare him sons, and his wife's sons grew up, and they thrust out Jephthah and said unto him, Thou shalt not inherit our father's house, because thou art the son of a strange woman. Then Jephthah fled from his brethren and dwelt in the land of Tob, and there were gathered vain men to Jephthah, and went out with him." Now that vain men does not mean that there was a bunch of men living together with mirrors all over the house, staring at their face, making sure that their hair was just right. That's not vain that way. That vain, it meant that they were also strong. They were men that were valiant. They did what was best for themselves. And Jephthah here is kind of a sad beginning to a story. You don't like to see a story start that way, and yet that's the way it goes. And I want to speak this morning for just a few minutes on men and women, people of strength within the church of God, so doing what we ought to do, stand up where we ought to stand up, fighting what we ought to fight, even when we're living in increasingly dark and perilous and hopeless times. And so 3 things I think we see in the life of Jephthah that we need to take heed of and do like he did. And let me just give you the first of those very quickly. First of all, when we talk about Jephthah, we can see his character in great difficulty. You see Jephthah's character in great difficulty. You see the way the story begins. Jephthah was not one of his brethren the same way the rest of them were. He was the son of a woman that was not his father's wife. And it's still a stigma in this day and age, but imagine going back 4,000 years to the day and age in which they lived there. This was unheard of. This was not done. This was an insult. This was unseemly. It was untoward. And as Jephthah grows up and his brothers grow up, they decide that they're not going to have Jephthah, who is not from their mom, living in the same house with the rest of them, and especially not going to have Jephthah, who is not the son of their mother, inherit part of what their dad has worked for. And so they thrust out Jephthah. They thrust out Jephthah. And yet you find his character in great difficulty. You see that he was not shackled by his past. He wasn't tied down because of the way his life began. And by the way, I heard someone say one time, there are no illegitimate children, only illegitimate parents. And that's the truth. And yet the life that Jephthah began to live here was one of embarrassment and shame. And his brothers were so ashamed that they cast him out of the house and said, you're not going to be with us. You're going to go do your own thing. And the Bible tells you here in chapter 11 that Jephthah fled from his brethren. The fact is, if you and I aren't careful, we will blame our past for our lack of ability to do things for God in our current situation, in our present. If anyone had an excuse to just go away, to live their life, to exist until it was over and die, it would have been Jephthah. He's humiliated, he's embarrassed, he's cast out, and apparently his dad lacked the backbone enough to stand up and say, no, you're not going to throw him out, he's my son, because he doesn't intervene here. And Jephthah's living a life out away from his homeland, away from his brethren, having to come up with a fortune all by himself. And if anyone had an excuse to say, you know what, this life, I'm just going to get through it, I'm not going to try to do anything, not trying to accomplish anything great, it would have been Jephthah. And yet you look at Jephthah, he's not shackled by his past. We're going to see he's one of the judges of Israel. That's why he is listed here in chapter 11. And I don't know what your past has, but I do know this. The devil oftentimes will come to you and convince you because of your past you can't do anything in the present. And it's just not the case. And so we see he was unshackled by his past. Your past does not dictate what God has in store for you in your future. And I'm thankful for that. That starts at the very moment of salvation. Look, when we're saved, God says He's going to wipe away all of that stuff. He has taken it and removed it as far as the east is from the west, as far as the heaven is above the earth. It's gone. It's not going to be remembered anymore. David said it's in the depth of the sea of His forgetfulness. And so at the very moment of salvation, God takes our past and He erases it and He clears it. And He says, I can still use you. Jephthah here is not shackled by his past, and yet you and I oftentimes will allow the devil to put us in chains because of what's taken place in our past. And I know we're dealing with a crowd, for the most part, that have been raised in church and didn't necessarily live a life out in the world the way some would have. But you and I aren't foolish enough to think that the devil doesn't come to us in the quiet of our moments and say, hey, you remember what you did back there that day? You remember what you did there? God can't forgive that. He can't use you because of that. And yet we have a God who's able to cleanse us and to clear us. Look, the Apostle Paul is a great example of that, isn't it? Isn't he? Look what the Apostle Paul was when he was Saul. This is Saul who's going to bring Christians bound to Jerusalem to stand trial, to be put to death, to be beaten and tortured. And somehow God saves him, turns his life around, and we know him today as the Apostle Paul, the greatest missionary since Jesus that has ever lived. Reached more people, preached in more places, started more churches. And even though Paul had a past, it didn't dictate what God could do with him in his present. And so your past and my past does not dictate what God can do for us. If that was the case, Jephthah would have been out of luck. Not only is he unshackled by his past here, and our past doesn't dictate, but the fact is, even though we live in a victim society, you and I have to come to the place where we are not going to be victims to our past. It is amazing if you read the newspapers or you watch the news for very much, you see that we live in a day and age where somebody's always at fault besides me for everything that happens in my life. You been there? I don't know if I told you, I read, this has been probably 7 or 8 years ago, I was reading a story out of, I believe it was Miami, it was a big city in Florida. And sometimes the gene pool is not very thick. So teenagers for fun in this big city would go into the downtown area. They would break into buildings. They would climb to the top of these tall skyscraper buildings in downtown Miami, and they would jump from one roof to another the way you've seen it on TV done. Well, in the act of jumping from one building to another, one of those teenagers missed, fell to his death, and his parents sued the building owner for not having a sign on there that says, "Don't jump off the roof of the building." And won. I was reading just a few months after that, because this story sticks out in my mind. There was a houseboat company. They rented houseboats. You could rent and have a vacation on a houseboat on a river. And it was a 2-story houseboat, and some people had climbed to the top of the houseboat. They drove off in shallow water, broken their neck. They sued the company that rented them the houseboat because they didn't tell them expressly, don't jump off head first off the second story of your houseboat. And they won. We're in a society. I remember when I was a teenager that idiot sued McDonald's because their coffee was hot and won. We're in a society where everyone's always at fault besides me. And if we aren't very careful, if we allow the devil to, he'll put that into our spiritual minds that we're a victim and that because we're victims, we can't do anything else. Don't you think Jephthah could have thought, look, I could have been living the good life except my brothers hated me. I'm the victim in this situation. I can't be used by God because of what has taken place in my past. I am a victim. And yet, he refused to be a victim in his life. We see his character in great difficulty. Can I show you what happens after they cast him out? I stopped reading in verse number 4. It says this, "And it came to pass in the process of time that the children of Ammon made war against Israel. And it was so that when the children of Ammon made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead," look at this, "went to fetch Jephthah out of the land of Tob." This is the guy who was kicked out of his house because he wasn't worthy to be around his brethren or to inherit his father's stuff. And yet when war breaks out, the first thing the elders of Gilead think they need to do is call Jephthah. He obviously had a reputation for a man that was a warrior and could fight, and we see that he had character in difficulty. And my friends, if you and I are going to accomplish anything for the God of heaven, it's going to require that we stand up and be men and women of character in difficult circumstances. We talked about the Lawsons this morning, and we've got a letter I think he's going to talk about next time with Brother Hayes at Marine Armed Forces Ministries. You have the Box. Look, they're not having an easy time of it right now. None of them are. None of them are. Brother Brian had shingles fly off his house this last week, fly into his house off the roof, just fell in. And he's convinced, I was talking to him yesterday, he said he's convinced the devil just took him and threw him in there to try to discourage them right before they had church services. I was talking about how they repaired them. I said, so they just come and glue them back down because they're the clay tiles? He said, you think like an American. They aren't glued on, they're just sat on the roof. The shingles in Brazil are just sat on the roof. He said they layer them, stack them, and then when they get to the top, they put a concrete cap on it. They just hope they stay because they're kind of heavy. Well, they didn't. And Brother Brian oftentimes will tell about the victories that are happening in Brazil, but he's oftentimes going to keep to himself the struggles and the difficulties that they have because they don't want to discourage people around him. And you and I have to come to the place where in great difficulty we're going to be men and women of character. The way that we find Jephthah is here. So we see his courage in great difficulty, his character in great difficulty. Let me look at his confidence in great danger. It says in verse number 6, "And they said unto Jephthah, Come." This is crazy. Think about this story. Now, at the beginning in verse 1 and 2, they kick him out of the house. And then you get time to get to verse number 6, "And they said unto Jephthah, Come and be our captain. Come and be our captain, that we may fight with the children of Ammon." And Jephthah said unto the elders of Gilead, "Did not ye hate me and expel me out of my father's house? And why are ye come unto me now when ye are in distress?" This just proves that the men in the Bible were normal human beings because Jephthah has a little bit of fun with this situation. He's like, hang on a second. This doesn't make sense to me. A few years ago, you kicked me out of my house, and all of a sudden you get into trouble and you're coming to me? The same exact reaction that you and I would have. Same exact reaction you and I would have. And yet, he's willing to hear them out. I got to be honest, if it was me, I probably wouldn't even have heard them ask. And my answer probably would have been, deal with it yourself. You didn't want me when things were good. Why would you want me to come and fight with you? Why would I fight for you and with you now? Leave me alone. And yet, that's not the story that we see from Jephthah. We see his confidence in great danger. Continue reading in chapter 11. Verse 8 says, "The elders of Gilead said unto Jephthah, Therefore we turn again to thee now, that thou mayest go with us and fight against the children of Ammon and be our head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Isn't it amazing how circumstances change some people's opinion? Isn't it amazing? Because here you have his brothers that aren't even willing to share their inheritance with Jephthah. Now all of a sudden they're saying, "Come and we'll make you our head." That is, you'll have the chief position. It's amazing how circumstances change things. And by the way, this is a lesson to all of us to be careful how we treat people that we don't need today, because tomorrow the shoe may be on the other foot. And young people, listen to me. As you get out into life, there's a lesson you should learn. Never burn a bridge in life as best you can. Shouldn't do it. You may not need that person now. They may be an aggravation to you, but you do not know how circumstances turn and how they might need to be of a help and of use and of a blessing to you later on. And we ought to be very careful. Now, the Apostle Paul says, as much as within you live peaceably with all men. And don't you think his brethren would have had a lot less crow to eat had they, in chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, treated him well? And yet here they're willing to make him their head. Verse 10, the elders of Gilead said unto Jephthah, the Lord be witness between us, if we do not so according to thy words. And Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead and the people, made him head and captain over them. And Jephthah uttered all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. You see what they did? They didn't just set him up. So he said head and captain. There's a reason they use both phrases, because captain deals with the military side of it. He's going to be their general. That's the word we would use on the military side of things. But the head, that meant he was going to be their civil leader. This is not just that they brought him in and said, fight for us. They said, come and fight for us, and if we win, not only are you the general of our army, but you're also going to be the next judge in Israel. You're the next leader. This is before God instituted the prophet, like he did with Samuel and Eli later on. This is where they're still being ruled by judges. And so you find here that the tables have turned, and there is confidence of Jephthah in great danger. He continues on here. Jephthah sent messengers in verse 12 unto the king and the children of Ammon. And I don't have time to read all the way down from verse 12 all the way down. You get into verse number 26. Where Jephthah sends a letter to the people, the children of Ammon that are going to attack him, and he basically says, look here, we didn't take your land. God gave it to us because you were jerks. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. If you go all the way back into the book of Joshua, when they were coming across the river Jordan and they came into the land of Canaan, the Edomites, if you remember the story, they asked permission from the Edomites just to pass through their land. Do you remember that story? They said, look, let us just pass through here. Don't make us go all the way around. Let us just pass. We won't sojourn here. We're not going to take anything from you. We don't need your food. Just let us go through here in peace. And the Edomites turned them away and said, no, you're not going to do that. Well, circumstances changed. God started giving them the land of Canaan. They drive out the Ammonites and the Edomites. And that's what Jephthah is relaying here. He is in essence slapping his enemy across the face and insulting them, saying, look here, y'all lost this land yourself. We didn't take it from you. You find there's confidence from Jephthah in the great danger that we find here. He was, not only was he unshackled by his past, but he was unfettered by his enemy. He didn't worry about who they were. And too often in our lives, we're worried about who we're fighting rather than who's fighting for us. You get into 1 Samuel chapter 17, you know the story of David and Goliath. You know the problem with the army of Israel before David got to the camp? They paid too much attention to who they were fighting. You get into 1 Samuel 17, and you're going to find out they knew how tall he was. They knew how big his spear was. They knew how much his armor weighed. They knew he had another that was an armor before him to bear his shield. They knew all about Goliath of Gath, and yet the armies of Israel failed to take into account who was fighting on their behalf. The difference between the armies of Israel and David was that David didn't pay much attention to Goliath. He knew who was fighting for him. What have I now done? Is there not a cause? He said, you come to me with a sword and a spear, and I come to you in the name of the God of the armies of Israel. Get to the New Testament, a better illustration. Jesus is preaching to thousands, and it's time to eat. And Jesus says, look, let's feed these people. And Philip says, Lord, all we've got here is this one boy's lunch. It's 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he says this, what is this among so many? Do you know what Philip was doing? The same thing that the armies of Israel did, the same thing that the people of Gilead did in Judges chapter 11, paying too much attention to who they're fighting rather than who was fighting for them. Moses and Joshua both said it to the people of Israel, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. God fights for you. Then you get to the book of Ephesians chapter 6, and we're told to put on the whole armor of God, and he says that we can stand. In other words, if we'll just make an attempt, God fights for us. And there's confidence in great danger for Jephthah. He was unshackled by his past, but he's also unfettered by his enemy. We see his reputation of godliness and bravery had preceded him. You see that he was a valiant man. That same word valiant is used in the book of Kings, where it's referring to the 30 mightiest men of David's army. And if you want an interesting read, get into the book of Kings and read about what those men did on behalf of David. A couple of them David they were encamped as an army at one point, and David says, "Oh, that I could have water from the well of Bethlehem." It was behind enemy lines. A couple of his men heard that, and you know what they did? They broke across enemy lines. They got him a drink of water, and they brought it back across enemy lines. You talk about bravery. And by the way, there's a whole message in that, because David got it, saw what had happened, and rather than drinking, he poured it out on the ground, said he wasn't worthy. He took that thing that people had risked their lives, he was showing he appreciated their valor. Jephthah in our passage is unshackled by his past. He's unfettered by his enemy. He's not afraid. And it's not because of his skill, I don't think, because you see the first thing he does when he gets ready to fight the battles, he's going to pray. And so we see his reputation of godliness. He was their first choice in the time of need. Where is it they went to? They didn't go to some other body. They didn't go to the oldest of Jephthah's brothers, who was what they would consider legitimate. They said, we've got to get Jephthah. He's a valiant man. He's a man of valor and honor. They knew he could handle this difficulty even though they couldn't. You know what you and I need to be in reputation of having? Whether it's our saved friends or our lost friends, when people get into difficulties and they need help and they need comfort, they need advice, they ought to think about you and I as God's people, that we can turn to so-and-so because they can handle this. When I'm discouraged, I ought to be able to think about people in my church that I can say, I'm discouraged, I can go to so-and-so because they can handle this. They can encourage me. They know who their help comes from. And I know someone else in the church is strong, just like his brothers did here. And let me just tell you, on the same basis of that thought, there are people at your place of employment that are watching how you handle adversity. They're paying attention to that. And if you and I handle difficulty the right way, not like it doesn't affect us, but we handle it the right way with faith, there may come a time down the road when they're reminded of that when they're handling something difficult. And they'll say, let me see what the difference between them and me is, I am. Greiber just left me for a second. He had a reputation for godliness and bravery. Let me say also, before he went to fight, he had some preparation. He makes a prayer. You'll find, let's see, where does he pray? Well, he prays in verse number 30. He vowed a vow to the Lord. Before he went to battle, he prayed. Before you and I get involved in a struggle and a fight, it's where we should start. It's where we should start. That book that's in your lap and our prayer life, our prayer closet, is where you and I should start. And we see his preparation for the battle. And friends, I don't have time to go through all the instances in the Old Testament and the New Testament where there was preparation before God used people to do big things. But the Old Testament's replete. There are stories in the New Testament the same way. Even the Apostle Paul was taken away for a period of 3 years to study and to train to get ready to serve God the right way. And so there needs to be preparation. You and I can't just expect to live our lives without ever thinking about who God is and what He can do for us and through us without getting ready for those battles that are coming. We talked about David Wednesday night, how he faced a bear and a lion before he ever got to Goliath. And even Goliath wasn't the ultimate end-all be-all in David's life. He faced more difficulty after that. Let me give you the third thing this morning. Not only do we see, number one, his character in great difficulty, we see his confidence in great danger, but we also can find his commitment in disappointment. Jephthah was a man who was a man of his word. He was committed even in disappointment. Now, I don't want to get into a theological debate because there is a discussion and an argument to be had out of Judges chapter number 11, and it's a discussion we can have outside of the pulpit. But what you do find is verse number 30, Jephthah vowed a vow unto the Lord and said, If thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the children of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, and I'll offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jephthah passed over unto the children of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. And he smote them from Aror, even till thou come to Minnith, even 20 cities, and unto the plain of the vineyards, with a very great slaughter. Thus the children of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. And Jephthah came to Mizpah, and unto his house, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and with dances, and she was his only child. Besides her he had neither son nor daughter. And it came to pass when he saw her that he rent his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, thou hast brought me very low. For thou art one of them that trouble me. For I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot go back. It's got serious quick. There's a couple of things about this story. First of all, when we talk about Jephthah's vow, God never asked him to make that vow. You don't ever see where God says, I'll give you this if you'll vow this for me. This is something that Jephthah promised on his own. And there has been theological debate as to whether or not this was a human sacrifice, and I'm just going to tell you, I don't theologically believe that that's what took place here. I'll show you why in just a minute. But Jephthah vowed a serious vow. He made a promise to God, Lord, give me this battle victory, and this is what I'll do. Whatever comes out of my house first, I'll offer as a burnt offering. And then when his daughter comes out, where he should be excited to see her because he's home from the battle and he's safe and sound, and she's playing music and dancing, and he sees her and he's obviously distressed because she's the first person that he sees. And you see what he says to his daughter right then and there in the middle of that moment? He says, I made a vow to the Lord. I've got to do what I told the Lord I was going to do. And friends, first of all, it's better that we not open our mouth than we make a promise and renege on it, especially to the God of heaven. We got to be real careful when we get into a battle that we don't negotiate with God. You don't negotiate with God. Very few people ever been able to do that successfully. I think of Abraham, who that story about the Sodom and Gomorrah is astounding to me, that Abraham negotiated numbers down with God. I don't. That's some kind of a relationship with him, isn't it? Lord, if you find 50, if you find 30, if you have 20. But that's not a good idea. And rather than Jephthah saying, Lord, here's the vow I make to you. You give me victory and I'll give you this in return. Jephthah should have said, Lord, your will be done. I'm going to go fight. Would you fight with me and for me? That's the way that should have gone. And it wasn't. And Jephthah, when he made that vow, he probably thought he would see some of his cattle. He would have seen maybe his pet. I don't think it entered into his mind that it would have been his one and only child, his only daughter, that met him. And yet, there it is. Jephthah had made a promise before this battle. He trusted his God to get him through the battle, and that's what took place. And Jephthah kept his commitment. Look on down when you get a little bit further down. He said unto she said unto my father, if thou hast opened thy mouth unto the Lord, do to me according to that which hath proceeded out of thy mouth, for as much as the Lord hath taken vengeance for thee of thine enemies, even the children of Ammon. She said unto her father, let this thing be done for me, that let me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down upon the mountains and bewail my virginity, and I and my fellows. And he said unto her, go. So a couple of things, some theological points we need to get out here. I don't believe that there was a human sacrifice given here. God never put a stamp of approval on that, not a single time in all of the Bible. You won't have one encounter where God says, I want you to actually has an offer. The closest you get is Isaac on Mount Carmel, and you know what happened. God provided himself a lamb. And so the argument is being made, first of all, it does not fit with the rest of Scripture that he would have offered his daughter as a sacrifice here. Secondly, when you begin to read what took place here, it's obvious, I think, what happened. If we go into the custom of the day, it would have been awful, terrible, unbearable for a woman not to have a child. If you get into the book of Genesis, you're going to remember the story of Rachel and Leah. And you remember what one of them says to her husband. She says, give me children or what? Or I die. That's what she said. You get into the book of 1 Samuel with the story of Hannah. And she is married and happily married and yet has no children. And the Bible says that her enemy tormented her and berated her and made fun of her because she had no children. It was just in the custom of the day. That was where the value was found for wives. And so when you read what takes place in Judges chapter 11, what you find is that I believe the vow that was kept here was that she remained unmarried. We have children in here, so I'm trying to be very careful in the way I don't want to raise questions for you parents. She remained unmarried her whole life, which means no children. Now, if you keep that in mind, read the rest of that chapter, what takes place here. Verse number 38. And he said, go, And he sent her away for 2 months, and she went with her companions and bewailed her virginity upon the mountains. And it came to pass at the end of 2 months that she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow which he had vowed, and she knew no man. And it was custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to lament the daughter of Jephthah and Gilead 4 days in a year. I believe that she was willing to do what her father had vowed, that he gave her to the Lord, and that she remained childless her whole life. That's how I read the story. You wanted to argue and discuss that afterwards, I'd be happy to, because the arguments can be made both ways. But it says that that from then on, she was remembered in Israel because of her sacrifice and her vow. And I get to that place where we see in Jephthah, we have a man who had character and difficulty. We see in Jephthah a man who was confident in great danger. He is being tapped to lead an army who is against impossible circumstances. And then you find in the end of the story for Jephthah that there was commitment in disappointment. And you'd say, well, preacher, how does that apply to me? There are going to be times in the Christian life where there's disappointment. It just is. Whether it's spiritually or whether it's out in the world, there are going to be moments of disappointment. And here's what we need to keep in mind. Even in those moments of disappointment, when my life is not what I think it should be, I ought to keep my commitments to the God of heaven. That is, I've given Him my life. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2 tells us we're to present our bodies a sacrifice, living, it's holy and acceptable unto Him. And we ought to make sure, even in the disappointment that we experience in this life, that we don't go back on our commitment to follow the Lord Jesus Christ. Once in a while, in the invitation in our churches, we sing, wherever He leads, I'll follow. And that ought to be the case, whether it's in disappointment or whether it's in victory, whether it's in easy times or whether it's in bad times. We ought to make sure that we take our commitment to the God of heaven seriously. And even in disappointment, we follow through and we are true to our word because He's always been true to His. He's not let you down a single time. He's been faithful over and over and over. And life will bring us difficulties. They'll bring us disappointments. Look, this last year's been a weird one, y'all. I was talking to some people this week. Sitting around the Thanksgiving table last year, can you imagine if we'd had conversations about what 2020 was going to hold? Can you imagine? Well, enjoy Black Friday because that's the last time you can go shopping without a mask. You better enjoy just being able to run to the grocery store without having to go in and be careful and not having to stay 6 feet apart. You better enjoy. Look, we had no idea that's what was coming, and some folks have been greatly disappointed. Some are struggling through 2020. And I would just say, even in the middle of disappointment, let's remain faithful to our commitment to our God because He's never failed us one time. It's the least that we can do. And what we need is some men and women in the church that are going to say, like Jephthah, I'm going to have character in difficulty. I'm going to have courage in the middle of danger, and I'm going to be committed in the middle of disappointment. And let's see what God can do with a group of men and women that'll get to that place, men and women of strength in the church, that the world can look at and see that, look, they serve Him when it's good, and they serve Him when it's bad. It doesn't affect their service, their commitment to the God of heaven. Would you bow your heads, please, and close your eyes? Piano player's coming.